The oppressive humidity of the Florida Panhandle hung in the air, thick and heavy, a constant reminder of the storm that had passed through the night before. The sky was a bleached, metallic blue. It was the kind of postcard-perfect weather the Gulf Coast was known for, but as Dr. Evelyn Reed drove her sensible sedan across the causeway toward Naval Support Activity Blackwater Bay, the sunshine felt too harsh, too exposing. The air, rich with the fecund scent of salt marsh and the open Gulf, did little to ease the tightness in her chest. This was her new assignment, a fresh start. But as she presented her credentials to the grim-faced Marine at the gate, the familiar, cold dread from her last fresh start coiled in her stomach. That had been Pearl Harbor. That had ended with a formal complaint and a quiet, hurried transfer. Evelyn Reed, a woman made for soft spaces, was now tasked with navigating the hardest environment on Earth. In her late 30s, she had intelligent, empathetic eyes, the kind that truly listened, and a calm demeanor that usually set people at ease. But today, her professional blazer felt stiff, like a suit of armor she hadn't yet grown into. Her new role was as a family liaison and psychological support specialist for the SEAL teams. A necessary position, the Navy had decided, after too many deployments ended with men returning as ghosts, or not at all. Her new office was sterile, smelling sharply of industrial cleaner and new paint. She hadn't even unpacked the hopefully small potted plant she'd bought. Her first meeting was with her new superior, Captain Grant. Captain Grant was a man who looked carved from sun-bleached driftwood. In his 50s, his face was a roadmap of deep lines etched by decades of command and glaring sea sun. But his eyes were tired. He believed in her mission, even if he knew his men would fight it. "Welcome to Blackwater Bay, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low gravel. He wasted no time on pleasantries. He slid a thin file across his immaculate desk. "This is your priority one, Jake Donovan." Evelyn opened it. A single photograph was clipped to the front. A man in full tactical gear, tense, focused, and unrecognizable behind the necessities of war. 6 months ago, Donovan's team walked into a compromised exfil, Grant continued, looking out his window toward the training beach. They lost Mark, his swim buddy, and his K9. Evelyn frowned, looking at the file. "It says here, K9, Shadow, recovered." Shadow was Mark's dog, Grant clarified, turning back to her. Mark was the handler. Donovan was the secondary. When Mark was hit, Donovan got himself and Shadow out. Shadow lives with Donovan now. That dog is the only connection he's allowed. Grant leaned forward. "Donovan is mission capable. He passes every psych eval, but he's walled himself off. He refuses all counseling, formal and informal. The man's a ghost walking among the living, and his team feels it." "And you want me to, what?" Evelyn asked, her voice small. "I want you to try. Mark's widow is worried. The team is worried. He paused, am worried. I've scheduled a mandatory session for him with you. He's not going to like it." Evelyn felt the chill of Pearl Harbor. A mandatory session. Forcing a grieving person when they weren't ready. It was exactly what had happened with the widow in Hawaii, a woman Evelyn had pushed too hard, trying to follow protocol, resulting in a breakdown that left the woman feeling exposed and abandoned. "Captain, with all due respect," Evelyn said, choosing her words carefully. "Forcing a man like that into a room can do more harm than good." "Dr. Reed," Grant said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Your job here is to find a way through the walls my men build. Donovan's is the tallest on this base. Consider this your first test." Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked toward her new office, the sterile white walls feeling more like a clinic than a sanctuary. She paused near a window overlooking the Strand, the stretch of beach where the SEALs trained. And there he was. She knew it was him instantly, Jake Donovan. He was tall, with the dense, coiled strength of a man whose body was a weapon. He was throwing a heavy training dummy into the surf. With him was Shadow. A magnificent, dark sable German Shepherd. Shadow moved with the fluid grace of a trained athlete, blasting through the waves to retrieve the dummy. But there was no joy in the game. Jake Donovan moved with a terrifying, silent precision. He didn't shout commands. A slight hand gesture was all it took. His posture was rigid. His face, even from a distance, was stone. And Shadow obeyed instantly, perfectly, but his tail was low, his ears hesitant. He'd return the dummy, drop it at Jake's feet, and sit, looking up with a profound, canine confusion. He was a dog waiting for a command from a voice that would never speak again. Evelyn watched the heartbreaking, silent loop of it, the throw, the retrieve, and the stillness. Jake and Shadow. They were two survivors trapped in the same moment, mourning the same man. Evelyn felt a sharp, painful pang of empathy. This wasn't a man who needed a manual. This was a man drowning in silence, and she, the woman whose last attempt to help had felt like a betrayal, was being ordered to swim out to him. The mandatory session was scheduled for 2 days later. Evelyn had spent the time trying to make her office less intimidating. She brought in her plant. She replaced the harsh overhead fluorescent bulbs with a softer lamp. She set up a coffee maker, hoping the simple gesture might disarm. At 14:00 hours, the door opened without a knock. Jake Donovan filled the doorway. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He wasn't just tall. He was dense, carrying an energy that seemed to suck the air out of the room. His eyes, a cool, clear gray like the ocean just before a storm, assessed her, the room, and dismissed them both in a second. "Dr. Reed," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a flat, emotionless baritone. "Mr. Donovan, come in. Have a seat. Can I get you some coffee?" He ignored the chair and the coffee. He walked past her, not to the chair she'd indicated, but to the window, placing himself between her and the view of the base. He stood at parade rest, hands clasped loosely behind his back, but it was the rest of a caged predator. Evelyn sat, feeling absurdly small behind her own desk. The silence stretched. He was doing his mandatory duty, being physically present. "Jake," she began, aiming for a tone that was gentle but firm. "I know this session is required. I want you to know this doesn't have to be a formal analysis. My job is just to be a resource, to listen." He didn't turn. He just watched something outside. "The captain mentioned Mark," she tried again. "And Shadow, I saw you with him on the beach. He's a beautiful dog." At the sound of Shadow's name, his shoulders tensed slightly. For another minute, he said nothing. Evelyn felt sweat begin to prickle her palms. The silence was a tactic. He was waiting her out. Finally, he spoke to the glass. "You're new from Pearl Harbor, aren't you?" Evelyn's blood ran cold. He'd done his homework. "Yes, I was stationed there previously." He turned. The full weight of his gaze fell on her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a cold, absolute finality. "Some wounds can't be fixed with a manual, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice quiet, which made it more devastating. "That's not what I'm offering," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's exactly what you're offering," he cut in, though his voice didn't rise. "You're offering checklists and sympathetic nods. You're here to check a box so Captain Grant can sleep better." He took a step toward the door. "Jake, please." She stood. It was a reflex. "That's not fair." "Fair," he paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Fair was 6 months ago. Fair didn't happen." He looked right at her, and she saw the abyss behind his gray eyes. "I was here because I was ordered to be. I've been here." He opened the door. "We're done. You can check your box." And then he was gone. The silence he left behind was heavy and suffocating. Evelyn sank slowly back into her chair, staring at the empty one he'd refused. The smell of her fresh brewed coffee now seemed bitter, mocking. The bright, hopeful Florida sun streamed through the window, but all Evelyn felt was the familiar, cold shadow of Pearl Harbor. Her first test, and she had already failed. The failure tasted like cold coffee in Evelyn's stomach. Sleep hadn't come. Long before the first gray streaks of light touched the Gulf of Mexico, she had abandoned her tangled sheets. She now walked barefoot on the damp, packed sand of the base beach. The pre-dawn air was cool and cleansing on her skin. The rhythmic crash and hiss of the waves was the only sound. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, her reset. But Jake Donovan's cold dismissal echoed in the ocean's roar. Some wounds can't be fixed with a manual. He was right, of course. That was the part that stung the most. Her by-the-book approach in Pearl Harbor had been a disaster. But his words weren't just an observation. They were a judgment. He had seen her as a checklist, and she had proven him right by having no answer for his finality. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter, walking toward the distant, skeletal silhouette of a fishing pier. The beach was empty, save for a few sandpipers skittering away from the foam. Then she saw them. Further down, near the larger waves, were the dark shapes of a man and a dog, Jake and Shadow. She stopped, her first instinct to turn and walk the other way, to avoid another confrontation. But something was wrong. This wasn't the precise, silent training she had witnessed from her office window. This was a struggle. Jake's voice cut across the surf, sharp and strained. "Shadow, sit." The dog, instead of complying, was spinning at the end of the leash, barking at the waves, a high, anxious sound that was almost a whine. He was digging frantically in the sand, then lunging, pulling Jake off balance. Heel! Jake commanded, snapping the leash. It was a harsh correction born of pure frustration. Shadow yelped, scrambled back, then started barking again, this time not at the waves, but at Jake. Evelyn watched, her heart aching. Her professional training took over, overriding her personal fear. She wasn't seeing a defiant seal and his disobedient dog. She was seeing a feedback loop of trauma. Jake's frustration was a heavy static energy, and Shadow, a creature bred for empathy and order, was being short-circuited by his master's pain. The dog wasn't being bad. He was terrified. He was mirroring the chaos inside the man holding the leash. She should leave. This was a private moment. To interfere now after he had so thoroughly rejected her would be seen as an aggressive clinical intrusion. He's not your patient, she told herself. But Shadow let out another, desperate bark. She couldn't walk away, not from the animal. She didn't approach them directly. Instead, she began walking in a wide, slow, deliberate arc, keeping her distance, angling her body so she was never facing them head-on. She kept her gaze soft, focused on the horizon, not on them. She moved in a predictable, calm way, making herself as non-threatening as a piece of driftwood. Jake spotted her. His body went rigid. Shadow, heel. He growled. The command was as much for her as it was for the dog. The tension traveled down the leash like a live current. Shadow whipped his head toward Evelyn, planted his feet, and let out a deep-chested warning volley. He lunged, hitting the end of the leash with a snap that must have bruised his throat. This was the moment. Her Pearl Harbor failure screamed at her to apologize and retreat. Instead, Evelyn stopped. She was still a good 30 feet away. Slowly, so as not to startle him further, she knelt down on the wet sand. She made herself small, and she completely ignored Jake. Her focus was entirely on the distressed German Shepherd. "Hey there," she said. Her voice was just a whisper, low and soft, almost carried away by the wind. She wasn't commanding. She was offering a sound. "It's okay. It's just the water." Shadow's barking faltered. He stopped lunging, his head cocked, ears twitching between her and Jake. He let out a confused whine. "You're a good boy," Evelyn continued, her voice an even, soothing rhythm. "A good, brave boy. That's a big ocean. It's okay. You're safe." Jake stood as still as a statue. He was holding the leash in a white-knuckled grip, but he was silent, watching this woman speak to his dog in a language he'd forgotten how to use. Evelyn slowly, so slowly, held out a hand, palm down, low to the sand. It was an invitation, not a demand. "It's okay, Shadow. Good boy." Shadow whined again. He looked at Jake, then back at Evelyn. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. Jake's grip on the leash was so tight that the dog was held back. "Let him go," Evelyn said quietly, still looking at the dog. Jake's hand flinched as if burned. He didn't mean to, but his fingers had uncurled. The leash went slack. Shadow moved. He didn't run. He crept. He approached Evelyn's outstretched hand with his head low, sniffing. He was still trembling. He nudged his cold, wet nose against her fingers. Evelyn didn't move. She let him investigate. After a long second, he pressed his head firmly into her palm. "That's it," she whispered. "Good boy." She didn't pat his head, which could be seen as dominant. She simply rested her hand on his neck, then gently, slowly, began to scratch the thick fur behind his ears, right at the spot that made his back legs start to thump softly against the sand. Shadow's whole body seemed to deflate. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and leaned his full weight against her knee, a profound canine gesture of trust. Evelyn looked up, then, and met Jake's gaze. He was staring. His face was a mask of profound, unguarded confusion. The cold finality from her office was gone. The anger was gone. All his defenses, built to repel doctors and commanders and teammates, had just been silently bypassed by a 90-pound dog. He looked at Evelyn, and then at Shadow, his dog, Mark's dog, who hadn't sought or accepted comfort from anyone in 6 months. And he simply did not understand. Evelyn gave Shadow one last scratch. She slowly withdrew her hand and stood, brushing the wet sand from her knees. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't mention his manuals or checklists. She just gave him a single, neutral nod. And then, leaving him on the empty beach in the growing light, she turned and walked away. From the hard-packed sand near the high tide line, another man had been watching. Caleb Hawk Vance, on his morning 5-miler, had slowed to a walk when he saw the scene unfold. Hawk was built like a bull with a booming voice and a fiercely protective loyalty, which since Mark's death had soured into a simmering rage. He had been Mark's best friend, Jake's teammate. He saw himself as the keeper of Mark's memory, a memory he felt was fading too fast. He watched this new psychologist, this outsider, kneel in the sand. He saw Jake, his frozen, impenetrable teammate, just stand there. And then he saw the unforgivable. He saw Shadow, Mark's dog, lean into her touch. To Hawk, it was a betrayal, a trick. This woman, with her soft voice and her clinic-smelling office, was a predator. She was using the dog to get to Jake, to break him and fix him, to check a box on her file. He felt a hot, protective fury rise in his chest. Jake wasn't a project, and Mark's memory was not a tool for her to use. He turned and ran, sprinting back toward the base, his boots pounding the sand. He wasn't just running from the scene. He was running toward a new fight. 2 days later, Evelyn stood before a small, bland conference room. She had set out a carafe of coffee and a plate of store-bought cookies. It was her first official bereavement and family liaison support meeting. It was a voluntary group designed for spouses and family members dealing with the specific, silent grief of a special operations loss. She had dreaded this. This was where she had failed in Pearl Harbor. She had talked too much, offered too many solutions, and failed to just listen. 7 women sat scattered around the table, leaving empty chairs between them. One of them was Emily, Mark's widow. She was a pale, fragile woman in her late 20s, clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red-rimmed and lost. "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn began, her voice gentle. "This space is yours. It isn't clinical. There's no agenda. It's just a place to be, to share, or to be silent if that's what you need." The room was quiet. The clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug was painfully loud. Emily finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the silence I hate. The house is so quiet. And the other wives, they try, but they're scared. Scared it will happen to them, so they stop calling." Another woman, older, whose husband had been lost in a training accident years before, nodded. "They cross the street, don't they? Like it's catching." Evelyn's heart settled. This was right. This was listening. She guided the conversation gently, letting them share, letting the small, shared pains build a fragile bridge between them. And then the door opened. Hawk filled the frame, his arms were crossed over his massive chest. He was still in uniform. "This is a family meeting, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice polite but firm. "I'm here for Emily," Hawk said, his voice dropping to a respectful register. "Mark's parents? They couldn't make it. I'm representing the family." He didn't ask. He took a chair in the back corner, an immovable, judging presence. Evelyn's carefully constructed sanctuary was instantly compromised. The women tensed, their vulnerability retreating in the presence of an active duty SEAL. Evelyn tried to regain the room's trust. "Emily, you were saying about the silence." But the mood was broken. The conversation became stilted. After a few more awkward minutes, Evelyn decided to end it early. As the women gathered their things, Emily gave Evelyn a small, grateful look. "Thank you. This did help. I'll be back." "Of course," Evelyn said, feeling a surge of relief. As Emily left, Hawk moved forward. The other women filed out, giving him a wide berth. "That was a nice little show, ma'am," he said, his voice just loud enough for the last departing widow to hear. "Excuse me?" Evelyn said, beginning to stack the empty coffee cups. "All this sharing. It's good. I just hope these women are getting the best support, the right support." Evelyn stopped. "Mr. Vance, if you have a concern, you can take it to Captain Grant." "Oh, no concerns," he said, his voice laced with a false casualness. "I'm just a big believer in transparency. I heard things got a little complicated in Pearl Harbor with one of your cases. A widow filed a formal complaint. I heard. She felt exposed. Pushed too hard." The room went cold. The last widow who had been lingering at the door slipped out, her face pale. The seed was planted. Evelyn's credibility in this fragile community had just been poisoned. "This is not the time or the place for this," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with anger. "Isn't it?" Hawk countered. "This is exactly the time and place. These women deserve to know who they're talking to." "You're grieving, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, trying to regain her professional footing. "And you're channeling the grief into anger. I understand." "No, you don't," he snapped, his voice finally losing its veneer of nonchalance and dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "You don't understand a thing. You're just here to fix things, and we are not broken. He jabbed a finger in the direction of the beach, of the base. I saw you with Jake on the beach. Evelyn's blood ran cold. You think you're so clever, don't you? Using the dog, playing your little mind games to get inside his head. He's been a block of ice for 6 months. And then you show up and I see him looking at you. You're messing with his focus. You're messing with his head. He took a step closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up at him. You weren't there, you didn't see what happened. You don't know a thing about Mark. You have no right to fix Jake. And you have no right to use Mark's dog to do it. He was shouting in a whisper, his eyes filled with a righteous, grieving fury. Leave him alone, he commanded. Leave us alone. Go back to Pearl Harbor or wherever they send people who make things worse. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and strode out, his bootfalls echoing in the empty hallway, leaving Evelyn alone in the sterile room. She sank into one of the empty chairs, her hands shaking. The stale smell of old coffee filled the air. He had taken her smallest, most private victory, that moment of connection with Shadow, and turned it into a weapon. He had used her past failure to destroy her present. He had hit her exactly where she was most vulnerable, confirming her deepest, darkest fear. What if I really am doing more harm than good? The fallout was immediate and quiet. Hawk's poison had been cruelly effective. On Monday, Evelyn received 3 email cancellations, all citing vague family conflicts. On Tuesday, Emily, Mark's widow, called. Her voice was thin and apologetic.
Evelyn, I think I just need some time.
Things are complicated. Evelyn understood complicated was a stand-in for Hawk. Exposed, unsafe. By Wednesday, her calendar for the rest of the week was a sterile, empty white. She sat in her office. The little potted plant on her desk, the one living thing that didn't seem to shun her. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was an accusation. Hawk hadn't just confirmed her fears. He had made them real. She was Pearl Harbor all over again, a well-meaning failure, an outsider who only deepened the wounds. She was packing her briefcase that evening, the weight of her own uselessness heavy on her shoulders, when her office phone rang. The sudden, sharp sound made her jump. It was the first call in 2 days. She expected Captain Grant, perhaps following up on her complete lack of progress. She picked up. Evelyn Reed. He's not getting up. The voice was unrecognizable. It was raw, broken, stripped of all its cool authority. It was Jake. He won't get up, he repeated. And this time she heard the panic simmering underneath the words.
I took him for a run, and he just collapsed.
He's not drinking. He won't even look at me. It's Shadow. Where are you? Evelyn asked, her professional calm snapping into place. Her personal failure evaporated in the face of a real crisis. The Bayview Veterinary Clinic off Gulf Beach Highway. They're running tests. There was a beat of silence, then, I don't know what to do. Stay there. I'm on my way. She didn't know why she said it. It wasn't her job. It was crossing a line Hawk had explicitly warned her away from. She didn't care. She had heard the sound in his voice. The sound of a man watching his last anchor slip away. The clinic was small, clean, and smelled of antiseptic and animal fear. When she walked in, the waiting room was empty, except for Jake. He was not the immovable soldier from her office. He was slumped in a bright orange plastic chair, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped. He looked up when the door chimed, his gray eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked surprised, then suspicious. How did you? You told me where you were, she said gently, taking not the seat beside him, but a chair opposite in the small room. How is he? They don't know. He's weak. He rubbed his face with his hands. He was fine this morning. Then he just stopped. Before she could answer, a man in blue scrubs emerged from a side door. He was in his 50s with kind, tired eyes and a gentle demeanor. Mr. Donovan. Jake was on his feet instantly. Dr. Miller, how is he? Dr. Miller, the clinic's head veterinarian, motioned them both into a small, private consultation room. Shadow is stable. We have him on fluids. His heart rhythm is irregular and he's very lethargic. Physically, his blood work is mostly normal. Then what is it? Jake demanded, his voice strained. Dr. Miller sighed, leaning against the counter. Mr. Donovan, I've been a vet on this coast for 30 years. I've seen a lot of K-9s, military, police, they're different. Their loyalty, it's absolute. And so is their grief. What are you saying? Evelyn asked, though she already knew. I'm saying, Dr. Miller said, looking directly at Jake, that physically, There is no major organ failure. But emotionally, Shadow is suffering from prolonged, extreme stress. His body is shutting down. In humans, we'd call it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome. His body is literally grieving itself to death. Jake recoiled as if struck. No, that's not real. It's very real, Dr. Miller said softly. He's lost his handler, his purpose. He's confused, and he's absorbing your stress, which is sky high. He feels like he's failing you, too. It creates a spiral. So, what do we do? Jake's voice was a mere whisper. We'll keep him on fluids and monitor his heart. He needs constant, calm reassurance. He needs to know he isn't alone. Dr. Miller looked at his watch. I'll be here until 10, but he can't be here by himself tonight. He'll get worse. I'll stay, Jake said instantly. I'm not leaving him. Good. Dr. Miller nodded. I'll set you up in the observation room. He needs to be watched. When the doctor left, Jake turned his back to Evelyn, bracing his hands against the wall. She could see the muscles in his back trembling. He was a drowning man who had just been told the water was his own fault. Evelyn thought of Pearl Harbor. She thought of Hawk's warning. Leave him alone. She stepped forward. I'll stay, too. Jake turned, his face guarded. Why? So you can take notes? The barb was reflexive, but it lacked its earlier venom. He just looked exhausted. No, Evelyn said, facing him, her voice quiet, but sure. Because the doctor said he needs calm reassurance, and you, Jake, are anything but calm. You're terrified. You'll stay, and you'll stare at him, and you'll panic every time he breathes differently, and Shadow will feel it. You need someone to watch you, and he needs someone who isn't falling apart. It was the harshest truth she could have delivered, but it was also the kindest. He stared at her for a long moment, suspicion warring with a desperate, bone-deep exhaustion. Finally, he gave a single, defeated nod. The hours passed in the dim, humming silence of the clinic. Shadow lay on a soft bed on the floor of the small observation room, an 4-line taped to his foreleg. He was sleeping, but his breathing was shallow. Jake sat in a hardback chair, his knees drawn up, his gaze locked on the dog's flank, watching it rise and fall. Evelyn sat on the floor on the other side of Shadow's bed, where she could see them both. They didn't speak for nearly 2 hours. There was no agenda, no therapy, just a shared, silent vigil. Around 3 a.m., the silence finally became too heavy. He used to sleep on Mark's bed, Jake said, his voice a raw rasp. Never on the floor.
I bought him a bed just like this one.
He wouldn't touch it. He just sleeps on the rug by my door, like he's waiting. He's loyal, Evelyn whispered. He's confused, Jake countered. I'm not Mark. I don't know the commands. Not the right way. I'm failing him. Mark, he'd know what to do. Evelyn watched him. This was it. The crack in the armor. You're not Mark, Jake, she said softly. You're not supposed to be. You're just his. Jake finally tore his eyes from the dog and looked at her. The dim light carved shadows under his eyes. Mark was just gone. He just disappeared. Now this dog, this is all I have left of him. Of that day, he swallowed, his throat working. His next words were so quiet she almost missed them. I'm scared, he whispered. The admission cost him everything. I'm scared he's going to leave me, too. He wasn't talking about being abandoned. He was talking about death. He was talking about failing to save Mark, and now failing to save his dog. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't offer a platitude. She just sat with him in the dark, in the humming, sterile room, and held his confession. The wall wasn't just breached, it had crumbled. Dawn broke over the Gulf Coast, painting the sky in soft shades of gray and rose. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the clinic's observation room felt harsh and artificial in the new light. Evelyn was stiff, her back aching from the hard linoleum floor. Jake hadn't moved from his chair, his posture a testament to a long night of rigid fear. Shadow stirred. It wasn't the shallow, labored breathing of the night, it was a definite movement, a shifting of weight. Jake was instantly alert, leaning forward, hands gripping his knees. Shadow. The dog's head lifted, his eyes, which had been dull and clouded, were clear. He looked at Jake, and then a small miracle happened. A weak, hesitant tail wag. Thump. 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 Against the bed. Just then, Dr. Miller pushed the door open, his face tired but kind. Well now, let's see how our boy is. He stopped, his eyebrows rising. Well, I'll be. Shadow, seeing the doctor, let out a low, soft woof, and wagged his tail again. He looked from Jake to Evelyn, who had scrambled to her knees. Dr. Miller knelt, placing his stethoscope on Shadow's chest. He listened for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. His rhythm is steady, strong even. Whatever crisis he was in, he's through it. He gave the dog a deep scratch behind the ears. You had us worried there, old man. Jake let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 6 months. He didn't say anything, just reached out a hand and buried it in Shadow's thick fur. Shadow turned his head and licked his wrist. The fourth fluids helped, Dr. Miller said, standing. But I suspect the company was the real medicine. You two stayed all night. Yes, Evelyn said quietly. Good. Dr. Miller nodded, looking at Jake. He's still weak, but he's out of the woods. He needs to go home. He needs quiet. He needs calm. And he needs to know his pack is intact. He looked pointedly between the two of them. Whatever you two did last night, keep doing it. He can be discharged in an hour. The ride from the clinic was silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the hostile, combative silence of Jake's office, nor the anxious, humming silence of the vigil. It was a shared, tired peace. The sun was fully up now, casting a golden, forgiving light over the quiet streets of the coastal town. Jake pulled his truck to a stop in front of Evelyn's small apartment complex. He killed the engine, but neither of them moved. Shadow was asleep in the back seat, snoring softly. Thank you, Jake said to the steering wheel. For coming, for staying. Of course, Evelyn replied. He tightened his grip, his knuckles white. He was a man of action. And these quiet, civilian moments left him without a script. I'm gonna make some coffee. Real coffee, not that sludge from the clinic. He finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes clear for the first time. Would you want to come to my place? Shadow shouldn't be alone. It was a fragile offering, a plea for help disguised as a practical need. Evelyn knew this was the real test. I'd like that, she said. His apartment was a small off-base rental. It was meticulously clean, sparse, and impersonal, like a barracks room. There were no pictures, no clutter. The only sign of life was a large orthopedic dog bed in the corner and a water bowl. As soon as they entered, Shadow, instead of going to his usual spot by the door, walked stiffly to a small rug near the couch, circled once, and lay down with a contented groan, his head on his paws. He was positioning himself between them. Jake went into the kitchen, his movements precise. Evelyn sat on the couch, feeling the exhaustion of the night sink into her bones. He returned with 2 heavy ceramic mugs. He handed one to her and sat, not on the couch, but in the stiff armchair opposite. They drank in silence for a moment. The coffee was dark and strong. He was the best handler I ever saw, Jake said, his voice low, staring into his mug. Mark, he didn't need commands. He and Shadow just knew. They moved like one person. It was something to see. Evelyn just listened. She didn't nod, didn't offer a clinical encouragement. She just waited. The mission, Operation Serpent's Tooth, he said the name like a curse. It was a mess. Bad intel. We were compromised before we even hit the target. He described the night. The shouting, the smell of dust and cordite, the chaos. We were covering the exfil. Mark and Shadow were sweeping the alley. I was on overwatch. I saw the muzzle flash from a 3rd-story window. At the same time, Mark, he shoved Shadow into a doorway to shield him. Jake's hands were shaking. He set the mug on the floor. I had the shot, a clean shot, but Mark was moving. He was in my line of fire. Protocol, he spit the word out. Protocol is you wait for a clean backdrop. You wait for your teammate to be clear. Instinct. My gut was screaming to take the shot, that the target was moving faster than Mark was. He looked up and his eyes were hollow. I waited. I followed the book. For a half second, maybe less, just a half second. His voice cracked. In that half second, the target moved. He wasn't aiming for me. He was aiming for Mark. Perfect shot. He got up, unable to sit still, and went to the window just as he had in her office. I froze. I followed a rule and my teammate died. He turned back to her, his face shattered with a guilt that was 6 months old but still raw. He had Emily. He was good. He was the best of us. I was just the trigger puller. It should have been me. I should have taken the shot. I should have moved. I should have done anything other than what the book told me to do. This was it, the confession, the wound that had been poisoning him, Hawk, and Shadow. Evelyn felt the weight of it. The easy clinical response. It wasn't your fault. It's survivor's guilt. You couldn't have known. She remembered Hawk's voice. You weren't there. She remembered the widow in Pearl Harbor. She set her own mug down. In Pearl Harbor, she said, her voice quiet but clear. The woman who filed the complaint, her husband was an F-18 pilot. He'd gone down during a training exercise, a controlled flight into terrain. Everyone told her it was a tragic accident. Jake watched her, his expression guarded, confused by the change of subject. But she was angry, Evelyn continued, looking at her hands. She was angry at him for being careless, at the Navy for not stopping it, at God. She needed someone to blame. She took a breath, the shame still sharp, and I wouldn't let her. I was new. I was following my own manual. I kept trying to move her toward acceptance. I told her anger was a stage. I kept pushing solutions. I made her feel like her grief was wrong. She looked up, meeting his eyes. She didn't need a therapist, Jake. She didn't need a manual. She just needed someone to sit in the rubble with her, someone to be angry with. And I failed her. I tried to fix her when she wasn't broken. She was just shattered. Jake stared at her. He saw the parallel. He saw her own confession. He wasn't her patient. She wasn't his counselor. They were just two people who had followed the rules and were now sitting in the rubble with a sleeping dog at their feet. He didn't say anything. He just went back to the armchair and sat. He picked up his coffee. The confession hung in the air, but it was no longer his alone. For the first time, the silence in the room felt like peace. A week passed. The confession had cleared the air between them, replacing the static tension with a fragile, quiet peace. Evelyn's calendar at the office remained stubbornly blank, the poison from Hawk's rumor still lingering, but it bothered her less. Her support group of one, it seemed, was meeting in Jake's apartment. She'd stopped by under the guise of checking on Shadow. The dog was thriving. He greeted her at the door now, tail wagging, no longer the anxious, broken creature from the beach. He was their bridge, the living proof of their shared vigil. They were sitting on Jake's small balcony, drinking coffee, watching Shadow contentedly chew on a new rope toy. The morning was cool, the air clean. Emily called me, Jake said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Mark's parents are coming to town next month. She needs me to clear out his storage unit, the one he kept on base. Evelyn watched him. His hand was tightening around his mug. The one with his things. Everything, Jake said, his voice flat. His old gear, personal stuff from deployments, things he kept from before. He had been avoiding it for 6 months. Emily had asked him to do it as Mark's teammate and brother, but he'd found 1,000 reasons. It was the final door, and he was terrified to open it. I have to do it today, he said, more to himself than to her. I keep not. Evelyn set her mug down. She saw the avoidance, the deep, paralyzing fear of that final goodbye. This was the critical moment. The moment after the confession when the real work began. Okay, she said softly. Let's go. Jake looked at her, his surprise plain. You don't have to do that. I know, she said, standing, and you don't have to do it alone. The on-base storage facility was a long, cold stretch of gray concrete and identical roll-up metal doors. The air inside the corridor was still and smelled of dust, metal, and time. Jake stood before Unit 23B, a heavy padlock in his hand. His movements were stiff, mechanical. He fit the key, turned it, and with a heavy groan, rolled the metal door up. Light cut into the darkness, illuminating a 10 by 10 foot space, neatly stacked with plastic tubs and cardboard boxes. It was a perfectly preserved timeline of a life cut short. Shadow, who had come with them, padded into the unit first. He went straight to a large, olive-drab duffel bag in the corner and began sniffing it, his tail giving an anxious wag. That's his deployment bag, Jake whispered. The one he never unpacked. They stood there for a minute, just breathing in the dust. Where do we start? Evelyn asked gently. Jake just shook his head, lost. Evelyn pointed to a smaller, taped cardboard box marked personal. Let's start there, one box. He nodded. He brought the box out into the corridor, slit the tape with his pocket knife, and they knelt on the concrete floor. It was Mark, his life in snapshots, a stack of photos held by a rubber band. A younger Jake, arm in arm with a grinning redhead. Mark, both of them looking impossibly young in their training fatigues. A photo of Mark and a much younger, scowling Hawk, covered in mud. A worn leather baseball glove, a small, carved wooden bird. Jake picked up the glove, turning it over in his hands. He taught me to throw with this, he said. Said I threw like a robot. A small, sad smile touched his lips. Evelyn found a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. From Emily, she whispered, setting them aside. Then, at the bottom of the box, Jake pulled out a faded, navy blue college sweatshirt. It was soft from 1,000 washings, the letters on the front cracked and peeling. "That's it," Jake said, his voice thick. He lived in this thing. Drove Emily crazy. He held it out. Shadow, who had been watching, buried his nose deep in the fabric, his whole body quivering. He let out a long, low whine, a sound of such deep, animal grief it cut through Evelyn's heart. "He still smells him," Jake whispered, his eyes shining. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was a hammer blow in the quiet corridor. Hawk stood at the end of the hall, his face dark with rage. He must have been at the base gym and seen them. He strode toward them, his presence radiating pure fury. "Hawk," Jake started, getting to his feet. "No," Hawk snarled, jabbing a thick finger. Not at Jake, but at Evelyn. She was still kneeling, holding a small, framed picture of Mark and Emily. "What is she doing here? This isn't a therapy session. This isn't some research project." "Hawk, calm down," Jake said, stepping in front of Evelyn. "Calm down? I come here and I find her," he spat, picking through his life like a vulture. "This is our stuff. This is Mark." His voice broke on the name. "You have no right. You have no right to be in here touching his things." He was yelling at Evelyn, but his eyes were on Jake. "You let her in? You let her in here? What? You need a chaperone to do what you should have done 6 months ago, or did you just replace him that fast?" The accusation was cruel and unjust, born from a bottomless, jealous grief. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She felt exactly as she had in Pearl Harbor, an intruder, a contamination. She set the picture down and started to rise, ready to apologize, to leave, to de-escalate. "Stop," Jake said. Evelyn froze. The word wasn't for her. It was for Hawk. "Hawk, stop. You're angry at the wrong person." "The wrong person?" Hawk laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "She's a stranger, Jake, and you're letting her desecrate this place." "You're not angry at her," Jake said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy calm that was more powerful than Hawk's rage. "You're angry at me, and you're angry at the truth." Hawk's laugh died. "What are you talking about?" "You've been angry for 6 months, Jake said, walking toward his teammate. "You've blamed Intel, blamed Command, blamed everyone. You've been looking for someone to hold responsible." He paused and his next words were like lead. "You're looking at him." Hawk stared. "Jake, don't do this." "You deserve to know," Jake said, his voice raw. "You were his brother. You deserve the truth." And he told him. He told him about the muzzle flash, the clear sight line, the instinct, and the rule book. "I froze," Jake said, the words echoing in the concrete hall. "I followed the book. I had the shot and I waited. Half a second. I waited and he died. It was my fault, Hawk. I let him die." Hawk's big frame seemed to shrink. The rage that had held him up, that had been his fuel for 6 long months, just evaporated. It left him hollow. He stumbled back, leaning against the cold metal wall, his face ashen. "No," Hawk whispered. "No, you're lying. It was the intel." "It was me," Jake said. "I failed him." Hawk looked at his teammate, the man he had followed, the man he had trusted. He saw the self-loathing in Jake's eyes, an agony that mirrored his own. The anger had been a shield, and now the shield was gone, and there was nothing left but the wound. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He wasn't a raging seal. He was just a man who had lost his best friend. He made a sound, a choked, broken sob that was torn from his chest. Jake didn't move. He stood there, exposed, having finally given Hawk the only thing he had left to give, the truth. Evelyn watched them, her heart breaking for them both. These two warriors, shattered by a half-second decision. This was the rubble. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, she quietly knelt, picked up the framed picture of Mark and Emily, and gently, respectfully, placed it back in the box. Then she picked up the photo of the 3 young teammates, Mark, Jake, and Hawk, all grins and covered in mud, and placed it on top where they could both see it. She rose, a silent witness, and waited. The concrete corridor of the storage facility was heavy with a post-storm silence. Hawk hadn't moved from the floor, his head bowed. Jake stood over him, not in victory, but in a shared, desolate space. Finally, Hawk scrubbed a hand over his face, pushing himself to his feet. He looked exhausted, older. He looked at Jake, and the anger that had defined him for 6 months was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow sadness. He looked at the box of memories. He always said he hated funerals, Hawk said, his voice thick. Hated the stiff uniforms, the 21-gun salutes. Said it was all for the living, not the dead. He said if he ever bought it, he just wanted a bonfire on the beach. Good whiskey and nobody in a tie. Jake nodded, a flicker of memory crossing his own pain. I remember that. Evelyn, who had remained a silent witness, saw the first fragile opening. So why don't you give him one? The two men looked at her. He didn't get the funeral he wanted, Evelyn said gently. But maybe he can still get the goodbye he deserved. A week later, Evelyn was in her office. Her calendar was still empty, but the silence no longer felt like failure. It felt like a pause. There was a soft knock on her open door. Jake and Hawk stood in the threshold together. It was a sight so unexpected it momentarily took her breath away. Hawk looked uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on the floor, but he was here. Ma'am, Hawk began, the word stiff. We're doing it. The bonfire for Mark, this Friday, Jake added, stepping inside. Sunset, North Beach, we want you to be there. I'd be honored, Evelyn said. There's more, Hawk said, finally meeting her eyes. They were red, but they were clear.
I spoke to the other families, to Emily.
I told them what I did, that I was wrong, that I was angry, and I took it out on you. He took a heavy breath. I told them what you did for Jake, for Shadow. They understand. They'll be there. It was his penance, his act of repair. Thank you, Caleb, Evelyn said, using his first name. That means more than you know. We're just getting the word out verbally, Jake said. Keeping it family. We just wanted to make sure you knew you were part of it. On Friday, the sun was just beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange, violet, and gold. The air was cool, carrying the clean scent of salt and a faint hint of wood smoke. On a quiet stretch of North Beach, a large bonfire was crackling, a bright point of warmth against the coming twilight. A loose circle of people had gathered. It was the team, their wives, their kids. Captain Grant was there, too, standing respectfully in the background, and at the center of the circle near the fire, stood Emily, Mark's widow. Evelyn arrived, her heart thumping. She felt like an intruder, despite the invitation. She stayed at the edge of the dunes as she'd planned, a respectful observer. She saw Emily, who looked up, caught her eye across the distance, and gave a small, welcoming nod. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Jake and Hawk stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the fire. Shadow was at their feet, lying peacefully in the sand, head on his paws, watching the flames. The picture of a healed pack. After a few minutes of quiet murmurs, Jake stepped forward. He pulled a folded index card from his pocket. He stared at it for a moment, his brow furrowed. The fire crackled. The waves hissed. He shook his head, a small, wry smile touching his lips. He shoved the card back in his pocket. Mark hated speeches, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the cool air. Said they were just wind, so I'm not going to give one. He looked into the fire. But I will say this, when you lose someone, the silence they leave is loud. It's a heavy, cold thing, and it's easy to get lost in it. It's easy to let it fill you up with lies. Lies you tell yourself, lies you tell other people. He turned his head, looking directly at Hawk. I was lost. I built a wall, and I told myself it was strength. I told myself a warrior, a seal, deals with it on his own. By the book. He paused. Then his gaze swept the crowd, searching until it found Evelyn, standing alone in the shadow of the dunes. I was following a manual that taught me how to fight, how to survive. But it never taught me how to heal. It never taught me what to do when the rulebook is the thing that gets your brother killed. The confession hung in the air, raw and honest. Emily closed her eyes. Hawk stared into the fire. I was drowning, Jake said, his voice not breaking, but carrying a quiet, naked strength. And then I met someone who was also betrayed by her own manual, someone who knew what it was like to follow the rules and have everything go wrong. He was still looking at Evelyn. The entire circle turned, following his gaze. Evelyn felt her face flush, her heart hammering. This was her nightmare. All of them, staring at her, the failure from Pearl Harbor. She didn't try to fix me, Jake continued, his voice softening. She didn't come at me with checklists or solutions when I was in the dark. She sat in the rubble with me. She sat on a cold clinic floor all night. He gestured to the dog at his feet. She saved Shadow. She reminded him his pack was still here. And in doing that, she saved me. He held out a hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. Evelyn, please. The crowd parted for her. She was frozen. This was the moment. This was everything she had feared and everything she had maybe hoped for. She took a step, then another, her shoes sinking into the soft sand. She walked out of the shadows and into the warm light of the fire. She stopped in front of Jake. He didn't lower his hand. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a gratitude she had never seen in any human being. Hawk gave a sharp, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he murmured. Jake stepped back, bringing her into the circle right beside him. And then Emily, Mark's widow, moved forward. The woman who had cancelled on her, the woman who had been warned away, looked at Evelyn with eyes that were clear and full of a sad, deep understanding. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and gave Evelyn a tight, fierce hug. "Thank you," Emily whispered in her ear. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." Evelyn closed her eyes, her own arms wrapping around the woman she had been so afraid of failing. She was no longer the outsider. She was no longer the failure from Pearl Harbor. She was here, in the circle, surrounded by the crackle of the fire and the sound of the sea. Held. She was home. Months passed. The harsh, exposing light of the Florida winter had softened, giving way to a gentle, hopeful spring. The scent of jasmine and salt now hung in the air, and the base, which had once felt so cold and foreign to Evelyn, had started to feel like home. Her office was unrecognizable. The door was always open. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the easy murmur of conversation and the constant hiss of the coffee machine. The empty chairs were now full. Emily, Mark's widow, sat on the small couch, not with a crumpled tissue, but with a bright smile, showing another wife pictures of her son's first T-ball game. Hawk, of all people, had stopped by last week, a box of donuts in hand, to mumble a thank you before awkwardly discussing a new training program for K-9 handlers. The poison had been neutralized, replaced by a deep, communal trust. Evelyn wasn't just accepted. She had become the heart. Her phone rang and it was a new wife, just arrived on the island. Just wanted to introduce herself. Evelyn was not the woman from Pearl Harbor anymore. She had sat in the rubble, and she had found her purpose there. Not in a manual. Jake had been deployed for the last 2 months. A short cycle, he'd called it. They'd spoken only twice in brief, static-filled calls that were more reassurance than conversation. He was due back. She was packing her briefcase, the late afternoon sun slanting through her window, when she saw him. He was just standing in her doorway, watching her. He was leaner, if that was possible, and the sun had etched deeper lines around his eyes, but the cold, hollow abyss was gone. His gray eyes were steady, calm. He was in civvies, a simple t-shirt and jeans, a duffel bag at his feet. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she breathed, her heart giving a sudden, unfamiliar lurch. "You're back." "Just got in," he said. He didn't move, just looked at her. And in that look was all the shared silence of the clinic, the shared pain of the storage unit, and the shared hope of the bonfire. "How was it?" she asked. "Loud," he said.
I missed the quiet."
He meant their quiet. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the door. "Shadow's been with Hawk. I'm springing him. He'll want to see you." They walked in the comfortable, familiar silence that was its own language. Shadow, upon seeing them both, nearly turned himself inside out with joy, a series of happy whines and full body wags, burying his head in Evelyn's hand before falling back into place at Jake's side. The pack was most certainly intact. They didn't go back to his apartment. Instead, they just walked. They walked through the quiet neighborhood streets, Shadow trotting happily between them, until they found themselves on the sand just as the sun began to touch the horizon, painting the sky in the same violets and golds as the night of the vigil. It was the same stretch of beach where she had first seen him, a man locked in a struggle with his dog and his ghosts. He was different now. He moved with an easy, relaxed gait. The tension that had held him rigid was gone. "The mission," he said, looking out at the water. "It was a tough one. We hit a bad situation. Reminded me of Serpent's Tooth." Evelyn stopped, her heart catching. He turned to her, and she could see the memory in his eyes, but the self-loathing was gone. The book said to fall back. My gut said to push through, that the enemy was weaker than they looked. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I trusted my gut," he said. "I took the shot. We all came home. It was a victory, Not just over an enemy, but over the ghost of his half-second. He had finally forgiven himself. He had thawed. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick. "You're the one who took the shot, Jake." She smiled. "No," he said, his expression serious. You sat on the floor with me. You let me be broken. I couldn't have. I wouldn't have without you." They stood there for a long moment, the waves hissing at their feet. Shadow ran ahead, chasing a sandpiper, his barks joyful and free. Jake reached into his pocket. "I wanted to give you this," he said. "I carried it with me." He placed a small, heavy object in her palm. It was a challenge coin. It was old, the brass worn smooth in places. On one side was the seal trident. On the other was a canine handler's insignia and a name. Mark. Evelyn's breath caught. This wasn't just a coin. This was Mark's coin. The one he would have carried every day. The one that should have been buried with him. "Jake, I can't," she whispered, her eyes filling. This is his." "I know," he said, his voice gentle. He closed her fingers over it. "Emily and we were talking. Hawk too, we were going through his things from the storage unit. This was in that box with the sweatshirt." He met her gaze, his own eyes shining in the twilight. "It's for family," he said. "It's for the people who have your back no matter what. The ones who sit in the dark with you." He paused, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "He would have wanted you to have this." She understood. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a romantic gift. It was something deeper. It was her challenge coin. It was her adoption. It was the final, definitive word. "You are not the outsider. You are not the woman from Pearl Harbor. You are one of us. You are family." She clutched the coin, the metal warm in her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. He took her other hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "It feels solid. It feels right." Shadow, seeing his pack had stopped, trotted back, circling them, nudging both of their hands, a happy, living, breathing circle of loyalty. Jake squeezed her hand. Together, they turned to face the horizon. The sun had just slipped below it, casting a brilliant golden glow across the Gulf of Mexico, chasing away the last of the shadows, promising a new day, a new start. They didn't have to run anymore. They were home.